What if the most popular dance videos on TikTok were hiding something sinister? What if the smiling faces, the viral moves, the millions of followers were all part of a trap? Because for a group of young, talented dancers in Los Angeles, that's exactly what happened. They thought they were building careers. They thought they were serving God. They thought they had found family. What they had actually found was a cage. A very well-lit, very photogenic cage. This is the story of 7M Films, a talent management company based in Los Angeles, California. On the surface, it looked like a dream. Young Christian dancers, gifted, passionate, driven, being guided toward careers in entertainment. TikTok fame, brand deals, world tours. But underneath the choreography, underneath the Bible verses, underneath the carefully curated social media presence, something else was happening entirely. Something that investigators, therapists, former members, and cult experts now describe as one of the most sophisticated manipulation operations of the social media age. The man at the center of all this is Robert Shinn. Pastor, talent manager, spiritual authority, and according to dozens of people who knew him, a manipulator of the highest order. Shinn had been running Shekinah Church in Los Angeles for decades. He was charismatic, persuasive. He spoke about God, about purpose, about destiny, and he had a particular gift for identifying young people who were searching for something, direction, belonging, meaning, and making them believe he was the answer. At some point, Shinn began recruiting dancers, not random people, talented, ambitious young Christians who already had a foundation of faith. People who were conditioned to trust authority. People who wanted to believe that their gifts were divinely ordained. He told them that God had given them their talent for a reason, and that reason was 7M Films. What strikes me most about this case, and I've studied a lot of these stories, is how completely invisible it was from the outside. These weren't people living in a remote compound. They weren't cut off from the internet. They were on the internet. Every single day, they posted. They danced, they smiled, they went viral. Millions of people watched them and thought, these kids are living their best lives. Nobody saw the control happening behind the screen. Nobody saw the fear. Nobody saw what it cost to keep smiling. Among the most recognizable members of the 7M collective were creators like Lars and Miranda, who had amassed millions of followers between them. They lived together in a house connected to the church. They trained together. They worshiped together. Their entire lives, social, professional, spiritual, were funneled through one man. And that man controlled everything. Let's talk about the money, because this is where the control became concrete. Former members have described a financial arrangement that in any other context would be immediately recognizable as exploitation. Shinn allegedly took a substantial percentage of their earnings. Some accounts suggest up to 75% or more. Their income from brand deals, sponsorships, and appearances flowed directly through him. Members reportedly had little to no independent access to their own finances. They were told this was normal. They were told this was God's design. That money was a worldly distraction, and that Shinn was simply protecting them from its corrupting influence. Think about that for a moment. Young people, some in their early 20s, earning real money and having almost none of it to show for it, and being told that questioning this arrangement was a sign of spiritual weakness. But money was just one layer. The deeper control was psychological, and it operated through the same mechanisms that experts have documented in controlling groups for decades. First, isolation. Members were allegedly discouraged from maintaining outside relationships. Family contact was restricted. Friendships outside the group were viewed with suspicion. Over time, the group itself became the only social world these young people knew. Second, dependency. Without independent finances, without outside relationships, without any identity separate from 7M Films and Shekinah Church, members had nowhere else to go. Leaving wasn't just emotionally difficult, it was practically terrifying. Where would you live? How would you pay for anything? Who would you even call? Third, spiritual coercion. This is the element that makes religious cult cases particularly insidious. When someone frames your obedience as faith and your doubt as sin, they've essentially weaponized your own belief system against you. Every instinct that told members something was wrong could be reframed as a spiritual failing, as weakness, as the devil testing them. Parents on the outside were the first to sound the alarm, and for years, nobody listened. They reached out to law enforcement. They were told it was a family matter. They reached out to journalists. The story seemed too strange, too niche. They reached out to anyone who would hear them, and mostly they were met with skepticism, because their children were fine. Look, though there they are on TikTok, dancing, smiling, posting. If something was wrong, surely they would just leave? That question, why didn't they just leave, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how psychological control works. You don't stay in these situations because you want to. You stay because you genuinely cannot see a way out. Because the group has become your entire reality. Because leaving feels like jumping off a cliff into nothing. One mother, whose story is featured in the Netflix documentary, described going over a year without a real conversation with her daughter. Phone calls were short, monitored, strange. Her daughter used language that didn't sound like her. Phrases that felt rehearsed, answers that deflected rather than connected. She wasn't my child anymore, she said. The words coming out of her mouth weren't hers. That sentence stayed with me, because that's exactly what psychological coercion does at its deepest level. It doesn't just control what you do, it colonizes how you think, how you speak, how you see yourself. In 2023, everything changed. Netflix released Dancing for the Devil, the 7 million TikTok cult. 3 episodes, dozens of interviews, and an audience of millions who had never heard this story, but who had probably watched these dancers without knowing anything about their lives. The reaction was enormous. Social media exploded. People who had followed these creators for years suddenly found themselves rethinking every video they had ever liked, every comment they had left, every algorithm-driven recommendation they had accepted without question. The documentary did something important. It gave people a framework. It named what was happening. And it showed, with real faces, real testimony, real tears, that the victims of this system were not naive. They were not weak. They were targeted systematically by someone who was very good at what he did. Former members who had been afraid to speak publicly began coming forward. The docuseries created a moment of collective recognition, survivors finding each other, realizing their experiences were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern. Cult experts who watched the documentary noted that 7M exhibited nearly every classic marker of a high-control group. The isolation, the financial dependency, the spiritual coercion, the us versus them mentality, the charismatic central authority whose word was treated as divine. This wasn't a new playbook, it was an ancient one, updated for the age of TikTok. By 2024, the legal consequences began to materialize. Robert Shinn faced serious criminal allegations from former members. The accusations went far beyond financial exploitation. They were deeply disturbing, and I won't detail them here, but they are documented in court filings that are part of the public record. Civil lawsuits were also filed. Former members, many of whom had spent years rebuilding their lives after leaving, now sought legal accountability for what had happened to them. The cases moved slowly, as legal cases tend to do, but they moved, and that, for many survivors, was itself a form of justice. The acknowledgement that what had happened to them was real, was wrong, and had consequences. What does recovery look like after something like this? Former members have been remarkably open about that process, and what they describe is not a single moment of liberation. It's a long, difficult, often lonely journey of rebuilding an identity that was systematically dismantled. Who are you when you strip away the group? When the community that defined you is gone? When the beliefs that gave you structure have been complicated, if not shattered? When the career you built was built inside a system that exploited you? These are not quick questions. They take years to answer. Some people find therapy. Some find new communities. Some find healing in telling their stories publicly, reclaiming a narrative that was taken from them. The detail that I keep coming back to, the thing that nobody talks about enough, is this. Most of these people joined willingly. They were not kidnapped. They were not forced. They were invited. They were told they were special, chosen, gifted, that God had a plan for them, and that plan ran through Robert Shinn. That's the architecture of manipulation at its most effective. It doesn't feel like control. It feels like love. It feels like destiny. And by the time it starts to feel wrong, by the time the doubt creeps in, you've already given so much of yourself that the cost of leaving seems impossible to pay. We live in an era of parasocial relationships. We follow people online. We feel like we know them. We invest emotionally in their lives, their journeys, their struggles and triumphs, and in that investment, we assume we understand them. The 7 million story is a reminder that we don't. That the distance between a TikTok video and someone's actual reality can be vast. That the performance of happiness and success can coexist with profound suffering. It's not just about 7 million. It's about the entire architecture of social media, the incentives to project a certain image, the pressure to maintain it, the way followers can become both audience and trap. Former members have described the physical toll as well. Constant training, performances, content production. The pressure to generate views, engagement, revenue, all while managing the psychological weight of a controlling environment. Exhaustion was the baseline. Rest was a privilege. And any sign of struggle was quickly reframed as a spiritual issue to be addressed by Shinn himself, which served to deepen his control rather than alleviate the problem. But here's what matters most. They got out. One by one, they found exits. Some left suddenly, with nothing. Some were eased out over time. Some needed help from family who had never stopped waiting. Some needed professional support from cult recovery specialists. And once out, they did something remarkable. They talked. They went on camera. They filed legal documents. They shared their stories with journalists, with documentary makers, with millions of strangers online. The same strangers who had once watched their dance videos. In doing so, they reclaimed their voices. And they gave language to others who were still inside, still silent, still waiting for someone to name what they were experiencing. As of 2025, legal proceedings involving Robert Shinn remain active. The full picture of what happened inside 7M and Shekinah Church is still being assembled. In courtrooms, in therapy offices, in late-night conversations between survivors who found each other through the documentary. The story is not over. It may never feel fully over for those who lived it, but it is at least now visible. If you haven't seen Dancing for the Devil on Netflix, I'd encourage you to watch it. Not for entertainment, though it is gripping, but as education. Because understanding how these systems work, what they look like, how they recruit, how they retain, that understanding is protective. It makes you a harder target. It makes you a better witness for the people around you. The 7M story is about a lot of things. About faith and exploitation. About fame and control. About the gap between what we show the world and what we carry privately. About the courage it takes to leave something that has become your entire world. But more than anything, it's a story about visibility. About what happens when the hidden is finally brought into the light. Stories like this one deserve to be told. They deserve to be heard. And they deserve to be remembered. If this video made you think, if it made you uncomfortable in the right way, subscribe to Storydrift, because there are more stories waiting. Stories with shadows that haven't been fully examined yet. Every story has a shadow, and we are just getting started.